Hey, folks. Welcome to our session entitled Science and Sanity at 90 Plus, a roundtable discussion on the publication of a new edition of Alfred Korzybski's magnum opus. and My name's Lance Strate. I'm from Fordham University and also the president of the Institute of General Semantics. And with me on this panel are four other trustees of the Institute. To my left, Corey Anton from Grand Valley State University. To his left, Laura Trujillo-Liñán from Universidad Panamericana. Laura is also the vice president-elect and will be in charge of next year's MEA convention in Mexico City. To my right, Thom Gencarelli from Manhattan College, and to his right, Susan Drucker from Hofstra University. So thank you all for joining us. And this is, we've been doing, or we will be doing this kind of session at a number of conference panels we have previously and are doing so in the future to mark the occasion, which is the first new edition since 1993. So what is that? And thank you to Thom for bringing this copy. You can also find a sample copy out by the registration desk where we have laid out sample copies of a number of the books that we publish and sell, as well as free copies for you to take of our journals, etc., and also some copies of a previous journal called General Semantics Bulletin. So please take as many as you like. The book in question is what I call the ore text of general semantics. It was Alfred Korzybski's second book, actually, but after writing his first book, where he introduced the concept of time binding, he then went into some years, really about a decade or so of reading. Korzybski was not an academic, he was an engineer, but he was trying to work out how to solve all the problems that human beings are heir to, in particular about the prevention of war and all of the other social and political problems, and came to the conclusion that a lot of the problems had to do with our relation to reality, or rather lack thereof. And that goes to both language, which is where most people sort of connect this, but also it goes beyond language to sensory experience and simply our ability to get a handle or an understanding of the environment that we live in. Part of his journey also included, and this, it sounds incredible from a contemporary perspective, where the head of a psychiatric hospital just let him, as an amateur, go in and try things out with the patients, which says a lot about kind of mid-20th century. But he did learn a lot from that experience, and that went into this, which is where, part of his shift in thinking went from something that was perhaps more sociocultural and political and economic into something that was more psychological in its orientation. And dare we say phenomenological? Can we say that, Corey?
Perhaps.
Maybe a little bit. Yeah. But also very pragmatic, very practical. And what he was saying was that he was trying to come up with a teachable system, something that ordinary people could learn and utilize to make their lives better, but that also could inform large-scale decision-making. And that's where this concept of sanity comes in, that sanity, in this case, is not opposed to mental illness, but rather to a sense of unsanity, which is the way most people operate, just the irrational quality in which most daily life occurs. So he puts together, and really, I consider that this is a book that encompasses, I think in its original version, it would have been about 800 pages. It now has accumulated over 100 pages of front matter, yeah, a little over 100 pages in front matter, and so the rest is in around 800 pages in that. Um, and so at this being the sort of foundational text for general semantics at the Institute, we certainly have a commitment as part of our mission to keep, Korzybski's works in print. And so uh, with I guess back in 1993, whoever was running the place back then must have ordered, several thousand copies of the fifth edition. I remember back in the old headquarters, they had boxes stacked up of this, but we finally hit the point where they ran out of it, which was reason enough to do that, but also 2023 gives us, is that 30 years since 93? Am I doing the math right? Yeah. Uh, so that seemed to be, an auspicious occasion for coming out with the sixth edition. Uh, and I actually announced it on X Twitter, and somebody said, well, why do you need a new edition of it? And so to explain that part of it, one of the main reasons was to come out with it in new formats. So we put it out in the traditional hardcover format, which is the one that's on display out by registration. For the first time ever, we have a softcover format, thanks to Thom for schlepping this all the way from New York, which is I mean, it's great that we could do that.
I did curls with it in the airplane.
Yeah. Uh, and we came out with a genuine ebook version. Sometime long ago, somebody had scanned it and created a PDF version, but in that old way that PDFs are, that are not really, uh, you know, searchable. So we had a new EPUB version of it that's been published as an ebook version, which is fully searchable, which is great. Um, as part of that, it does, because pagination doesn't work on ebook versions. It doesn't have the index. So if you want to, your best bet is to get both copies, both the hard and the EPUB version, to coordinate those two. But speaking of the index, it has an updated index because as part of the new formatting, some of the pagination was changed, requiring some updating of the index, but also some addition because we added a new preface to it to add to the front matter, because you can never have enough front matter. But it, partly to bring it up to date and to note its significance, because earlier front matters included some of Korzybski's own additional thoughts about the work for the subsequent editions. And then for the fifth edition, one of the kind of some experts in general semantics in an earlier generation, Robert Kula, did a very nice summary of general semantics in general, kind of general semantics in a nutshell. That is his preface to the new edition. And on top of that, part of what this allowed us to do was to make it available through online booksellers. And it sort of blew my mind that the previous version, there was no pathway except to get it through the General Semantics store, through the IGS website. So you couldn't find it except for older editions on Amazon because everyone uses Amazon. Let's insert here, required put down or criticism of Amazon and all of that. But I mean, we all do it, and all the other online booksellers. So now you can get it in those ways, but we also sell it through, we have an online store through our website. It works through the Shopify uh, set up. And if you are a member of the IGS, you can get a discount. We have a 15% discount. You have to ask for the discount code. But for this period of time, up until through Sunday, there's a special MEA discount for anything on the IGS store of 20%. So, please feel free to take advantage of it. All right. So the question is, what the hell does this matter? Because when you come down to it, this is a work that kind of diehard folks in general semantics will say you have to read this. All of the other works that have been done from S.I. Hayakawa, Wendell Johnson, Irving Lee, they are all kind of watered down. They miss important aspects of it. This is the one to really go to understand general semantics. And yet, well, I mean, apart from its extreme length, which, okay, well, if you read Game of Thrones or whatever, it's not that big a deal. But it is quite long, but it's also quite challenging as a read, partly because English was not Korzybski's native tongue. And he was from Poland, and that was his native tongue. And in some cases, because he knew French, some of the similar words, he would perhaps not get the meanings quite right, or get, I mean, particularly the word semantics, which apparently has a somewhat different meaning in French. I don't know French, so I can't say that, but he wasn't thinking about it in the sort of simple sense that it's used in English and linguistics. Partly also because Korzybski was an engineer. So this book is full of math. And well, that's a different symbol system, and it's worth thinking about for us media ecologists, how that represents the world differently. As a scientist, for Korzybski, math was very significant, even though it's very highly abstract. It's extremely precise and offers us a view onto reality that we don't get from words, which are often can lead us astray. And he also argued for the importance of visuals. Again, thinking scientifically, diagrams, scientific illustrations, and of course, photographs offering more detail than words can capture about various kinds of phenomena. So he looked to both of those, and offered a strong critique then about language, problems inherent in language, but also about sense perception itself and how that is not to be mistaken from the reality out there. But the science in Science and Sanity is rooted in this idea that empirical method, right, using sense perception and its extensions, has proven to be our most successful way of getting a handle on whatever is out there. And that scientists are great at it in their own kind of narrow way. We need to generalize from that to the world, to everyday life and to areas that don't employ scientific method, like politics, economics, for all that they pretend to, and sociology, anthropology, and psychology, and so forth. But all of this makes for a challenging read that many people don't ever get through or try or don't even start to. And yet there's something very important about it. And this is a book that is groundbreaking and is significant and is crazy in its own way. But as media ecologists, we're no strangers to that. it's crazy in a totally different way from the way understanding media is crazy. Uh, but we're here to, to see the importance, and the important ideas in some of these works. So I've talked a lot now, so I want to kind of turn it over to our panelists, and have them talk about their views on the significance of the work. So I don't know if we want to go in alphabetical
Sure,
order.
sure.
You always complain
I know I do.
about this,
I do, but I'll
Corey.
happily do this, and I'll try to keep my comments brief. I'll try to keep it into 10. I know people would like to talk here. So let me say some things, yeah, about the book. I'll say I agree with Lance. It is a highly significant text. It's not my favorite of Korzybski's. I do think Manhood of Humanity is a better intro, or even the Olivet College lectures. You get more like basic examples. He's giving lectures to students, but it really is a very important work. I think what I would want to say is that it's, again, echoing some of Lance's observations, that Korzybski was fascinated of how engineers could build bridges and they would stay up, but then people would build societies and they would collapse. And like, what was the difference there? And I think he wanted to figure out a way to bring a rigorous scientific orientation to everyday life. And one of the ways he did this was he drew an important distinction between what he calls intentional, and not with a T but with an S, intentional versus extensional, and orientations. And he basically means that the extensional orientation is the orientation of the scientist. It's you're carefully checking your representations, your current models, your current theories, and you're trying to see how well they align to or disalign with the territory that you're trying to understand. But he thought that many people, unfortunately, they lived by what he called intentional orientations. They kind of just take the cultural hearsay or the assumptions of what people say, that what he calls mere verbalism. It could be things like religious dogma, but it's also things like just cultural assumptions. And I think he's trying to do in a lot of different ways, like from my own perspective, is his whole project is something equivalent to like a Western scientific Buddhism. That he's trying to get people to become aware of first these processes of abstracting that are going on at multiple levels. So, like the nervous system abstracts out, and then various kinds of symbol systems abstract from what the nervous system has abstracted out. And he wanted to get people, again, basic concepts like knowing the difference between an animal signal and a human symbol. He talked a lot about semantic reactions. And when he talks about a semantic reaction, he means that the organism as a whole in an environment, it includes its evaluation. I mean, it's sort of like a science of evaluation. He's trying to get people to realize how they evaluate in certain ways, and that evaluation is included. It's filtered through something like the belief systems, the overall symbol systems. And what I think he wanted to do is see to what extent he could get people to not only become conscious of their various kinds of abstracting, but to learn how to delay reaction, like to delay response, and to again become more aware of the particular kinds of obstacles that people face when they are trying to get, as Lance says, unsane, when they're trying to get out of being unsane. What how do you do that? He did have a lot of very useful teaching tools. I think one of the most famous is what's called the structural differential. It appears many places through the book, where he's trying to differentiate between what he would call something like the event level of reality versus the object level, what we perceive through our senses, compared to the various verbal levels. Um, I think, I guess, one of the ways to get at, I guess, the relevance of the book, but also the challenge of the book, is to talk about like the current situation, the political situation that's going on. Thom and I do have uh, I have a special issue out right now in et cetera on politics and general semantics, and we do have an edited book that's going to be coming out in the next year or so on this. I think this is maybe where the media ecology and general semantics, they sort of connect up in this question of how does mediation affect what Korzybski means by environment. See, one of his most famous statements is the map is not the territory. Again, the word is not the thing. And he tried to say, when he says the map, he means it on a lot of different ways. In one ways, he literally does mean like a map, and a map has to have a structural correspondence to a territory. But he also meant like our words are kinds of mappings. Our nervous systems are mappings of like processes that are going on around us. But I think the difficulty that I would want to raise here, or for our discussion, would be the what happens when people no longer share an environment, but that when everyone becomes increasingly atomized, and what they called the territory was actually just a different layer of a map. I think, like when I'm here right now, I can stand up and I can move around. And if I show you something, we can all see the perspectival nature of it. And we're here together and we're able to share in that. But when we have some, everybody's on their headset on and they're all looking at their phones, and they're in a shared space, but they're partly somewhere else, and they're getting information flows from elsewhere, taking it to be a register of the environment, but it's already symbolically concocted, and it's serving certain interests. I think it creates new struggles for us to talk about how do we collectively generate consciousness of our abstracting. That is, I think increasingly people are so layers and layers and layers in that it's almost like this Baudrillardian situation where we're now not really sure of what's real and what's not real. And I think that Korzybski still wanted us to be grounded in like immediate sense perception and to be able to move out from there. And I think one of the concerns is what will sanity look like as increasing numbers of people are not only just accessing the world like almost 90% through online, but as online world becomes more and more AI generated and things are far and far removed from, we'll call it sensory abstraction to sort of hyper simulated simulation, right? And it's I guess some of the difficulties that we're going to face as a society as that happens. That said, I do think the strength of Korzybski, and I'll just sort of wrap up with this observation that he does have a lot of basic thinking tools for trying to assess how we evaluate. And I say a lot of them are just like basic concepts, like getting very clear, as I said, on this distinction between having an opinion that's liable to be revised when new information gets introduced. That's an extensional orientation. The intentional orientation is having a strong opinion about something and you haven't really checked for yourself. And you get, again, people get very dogmatic. You might even take something like a city, right? So you say, well, if I say a word like Los Angeles, or if I say like New York, my guess is you all have some feeling. So again, there's an overall organism in reaction to that word, and it's grounded in all of our different particular experiences. But even somebody who's been to New York or to Los Angeles and spent a good amount of time there, they've always done it from a perspectival sort of sense. They've always had very selected kind of um, mappings there, and the uh, I think the issue here is how do you get people to say, yes, I have a very limited view, even though I do have direct experience with it, it may be different from someone else's experience. I think some of it, it requires a kind of like a humility to go, okay, even when we do have direct access, we can still have very different experiences of something. But now when we're increasingly with just, like I say, maps upon maps upon maps, I'm not sure exactly how that's going to go on. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Sue, do you want to?
Sure. Um, how do you begin to deal with a 91-year-old classic? Now, I ask myself that every day. And how do you deal with a volume that people say changed their lives? So when I approached this topic, this volume, um, it was with the reality that this is an important book and a very personal book to a lot of people, and it's not an easy read, as Lance indicated. It's not easy. It's not even easy to lift on certain days. There are days that I'm very grateful that I come from a family of weightlifters. It is additionally difficult, as Lance indicated, in that it's written from the perspective of, and using the symbol system of someone steeped in mathematics and physics, which makes the challenge of reading this book, dealing with the concepts, an even heavier lift. So with that in mind, I try to approach kind of the challenge of this session from the perspective of somebody that is a neophyte, that has absolutely no experience, no contact with science and sanity previously, and try to understand what this book means from the get-go. I should start out by saying that I was struck by the timing of the book. So a book written in 1933, the year that Hitler rose to power, through legal means, I should say, certainly resonates in the United States political environment of 2024, as well as many other countries. At a time of division where language is used as a weapon against a perceived enemy or any perceived enemy, the power of language and the danger of language is really underscored in this volume. And therefore, it really resonates currently. It stays very powerful. Science and Sanity deals with a number of key concepts, I mean, many key concepts in 800 pages, but a number of key concepts that in terms of thinking of the tenor of the political times in which we live, and the special issues on politics couldn't be more important right now. Several key concepts really leap out from that kind of newcomer's perspective. I just want to mention briefly a few of the concepts that kind of going through the book, highlighting what I did on my sabbatical, going back and rereading. Science and Sanity covers, as Corey mentioned, abstraction. And abstraction and the concept of abstraction in the real world is really, I think, very much at the heart of the volume. And it explains how humans are able to convey information and memories and learning through symbols, through words. It recommends that we get rid of black and white thinking, that kind of either or logic that we inherited from Greek thinkers. General semantics provides a set of tools, as Corey mentioned. It's a set of tools that help us hopefully improve our thinking very pragmatically in terms of making decisions. And so it's that concept of abstraction. It's one of the ones that I come back to. I think the argument of the book is that many of our personal and social ills arise through the use of the Aristotelian principle of identity, leading to confusion between what is labeled and the thing that is labeled. So the map is not the territory, obviously, but a label is not the entire reality. So if you say, for example, John is fat, well, that's not all that John is. That label is incorrect, but we get caught up in these labels. Sanity or rationality can be achieved through developing a consciousness of abstraction, and that awareness that's so important. The awareness of whatever we say about someone is only a partial formulation of a few characteristics of the total person or the total event. So when we get excited about and get involved with certain arguments. Sometimes that's rooted in the fact that one may abstract from a whole differently than another. And it goes back to this, to the idea that that's an insight, the awareness of how we see things differently, how seeing the same thing, we may be extracting and emphasizing different things, can lead to conflict. It's an insight that I think we need more than ever in the age that we're in, where we tend to see the other in very stark terms, in terms of division. Another proviso, another takeaway from that kind of first read of the volume is the importance of a pause, of taking time to reflect, of as Corey mentioned, the delayed response, and not jumping to conclusions. And I think that with the speed in which today we receive information, we're encouraged to jump to conclusions. And I think that idea of reflection and delayed response is all the more important in this media environment as compared to the media environment in which the volume is written. As I said, I think the book continues to resonate for me in terms of the political environment in which we are. There's also the concept that people are different at different times. Things are different at different times. And that awareness, I think, also helps useful reflection. I mean, ultimately, to go back to what Lance and Corey was saying, we're talking about a scientific methodology. And what we're essentially saying is that Korzybski considered his proposals as an empirically based methodology, where he hoped the general semantics would be accepted as a scientifically endorsed methodology, that it would be accepted in that way. And it really strikes a chord for me personally. I grew up the daughter of a chemist, and I didn't realize it at the time, but in reflection, I realized that the dinner conversation so many nights was about essentially the importance, the power of scientific method. I wish I'd listened more at the time. But in going back and reading Korzybski, it really struck me. He was speaking the language of my father. And that was a particularly powerful and personal takeaway, that how if I'm not living in a scientific world, and that's not my mindset, how useful that mindset can be, how useful those tools can be. But I want to just round out my comments by talking about this particular volume, because as Lance said, the last volume was published 30 years ago. And I actually went back and compared the introductory material of the 5th volume and the 6th edition. And I can go into some, particularly the material that Lance dealt with. But it begins with the premise that we're dealing with a classic. And it's a classic that withstands the test of time. That all of the changes since 1933, everything from World War II to climate change, can be looked at through the lens, through using this empirical methodology, through what the volume provides. And what I found in comparing volume, the 5th printing, the 5th edition to the 6th edition, was that, and it pains me to say this, that Lance's introduction is really powerful. It's really important. That if you're trying to introduce others to the field of general semantics, that those pages that have been added in the 6th edition provide a gateway that I think is really manageable, really useful, something that, whether it's a neophyte coming or students that you're trying to bring into general semantics, that this is a great launching pad, and that there's a real service that this book does, this volume does, that other volumes hadn't done. You're a great translator of Korzybski. And ultimately, I think not only is the book a classic, but the introduction's a classic as well. And that, I think, in an age of disinformation, in an age in which we're faced with disinformation fueled by the internet, by social media, by, it seems, all these forces surrounding us, is more important than ever before. And if a preface can make an 800-page volume seem manageable, user-friendly, then that's a great service that was done. So I'll leave it at that. Other than the fact that I think I started to gain some muscle carrying that book around. And by the way, who calls that? Like you said, like, I kept looking at that thinking paperback. I don't think so. That's not a paperback you carry through an airport easily.
Thanks.
Okay,
Tom? Yeah.
Let me say 3 quick things in preface. First of all, we were at the IGS office. Did that fall over? It's lying on its side? Yeah, it's okay. Okay. The office at this point is really just a collection of stuff that we've inherited, that we salvaged, that we've collected over the years from the Institute's history. But we were talking about, the book and the fact that we don't have a complete collection of all of the issues, right? And so we get onto eBay and we get onto abebooks.com, and we find a first edition copy at a bookseller, and it was $80-something, and I'm like, that's okay. But Lance right away just buys it off of eBay, and it's delivered a week later, and it was a signed copy. It is a signed copy, so Korzybski's signature's in there. Again, it's like, I've looked at signed versions of McLuhan's books, and they'll go for $1,000, $2,000. I don't know really in the grand scheme of things what a Korzybski signed first edition is really worth, but to us it was like magic. It was golden. Second thing, and I want to riff off of what Sue already said. I read Lance's preface in manuscript. He asked a couple of us to look it over before it went to press. And, Poola's preface to the previous edition, I think is great. It really is, in a way, a user's manual, right? To really, cut to the chase of what you will find if you're willing to do the deep dive in the rest of the 800 pages. But as Sue said, I think Lance's preface, it speaks to the fact that, him serving now as president of IGS and a continuation of the tradition of general semantics and time binding our way through, where we are now, and who knows where we're going after this, right? And who knows what happens after Lance and the Board of Trustees. But I don't know what order you should read these prefaces. Is that right? Prefaces? I don't know I think you should read Poola's first and then read Lance's, because again, Poola's is like the sort of user's, manual, and Lance's puts it all into context in very much the way that we're trying to talk about it here. Third real quick thing is, so when I was introduced, I wasn't really introduced to Science and Sanity and to Korzybski's work in the way that my colleagues at NYU in the media ecology program were introduced to it. Terry Moran, when I first got there, advised me into a course that didn't have enough students, and in order for it to run, he was like, yeah, you should take this. And it was a waste of my time, and I didn't get to take, what was the course? Language, Thought, and Behavior?
That was one of the.
Yeah, it was one. I didn't get to take the courses that everybody else took, where they didn't necessarily read this, but they had the introduction to really what general semantics is. And I made nice with Terry a long time after this, and I love him, but I was a little bent out of shape about that. So my introduction at the time was Neil Postman was the editor of Etc., and that's one of the reasons why I'm serving as editor now. But I didn't come to an appreciation of the project until I read Bruce Kodish's biography of Korzybski and learned about his, as a Polish count, serving as an officer in the Polish army on the Russian front during World War I, and seeing the horrors of war and living through it and coming back. And I guess, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the project is rooted in manhood rather than in science and sanity. But coming back from that and saying, how is it that human beings, he talks in Manhood of Humanity about the fact that we are time binders. Let's put that in context, right? There are energy binding species, there are space binding species, and there are time binding species. Plants are an energy binding, I'm sorry? Chemistry binding? Okay, chemistry binding. Plants take sunlight, take water, take CO2, convert it into oxygen on behalf of the rest of us. But they are stuck in their place for their existence until they die. Animals are space binders, but they're space binders and they're chemistry binders too, right? That, we eat to create the energy that we need to grow and to live and be strong, and to travel through the world, and we defecate, and create fertilizer in doing so. I mean, other species, bees, will pollinate plants and travel around from plant to plant to enable, right, that plant life and the flowering of it. And then so humans, right? Well, we're all three, right? We are time binders with respect to the idea of, and I'll use Neil Postman's social sciences moral theology here to say, we're all storytellers. And so a scientist or an applied scientist will tell his, her, their story in a certain way. A mathematician, an applied mathematician, will tell his, her, their story in a certain way. Mathematics, of course, is a discursive form, just like language itself is. And, and I'm thinking back actually to Philip, to your presentation and Michael's response before about the fact that, well, the process of time binding is not just language based, but it's about the fact that the thinking is not just talking to ourselves in our heads. It's about having a visceral experience, a primitive brain, and the evolved brain, and turning percepts into concepts. But again, we're animals. And the issue, the problem that the project tries to take on is, can we figure out a means by which we can overcome the animalistic parts of us and try to be, as a collective group of 8 billion people on the planet, unsane, and live together in ways that we don't kill each other for the reasons that we do. And so what's interesting about the development then of this instruction manual for how to try to bring this about is, we're academics, and we sort of have a predisposition, a predilection to want to problematize things and extend ideas and question things. And yet, here's a manual that says, no, follow this. Use these tools and techniques and ideas to our collective benefit. Well, but again, it's also about time binding. And so if this is the blueprint and it all stops there, well, what do we do then with this idea that we are going to continue to time bind beyond it and use it? And so there's been this interesting sort of schism between the folks who are practitioners and who see this as the Bible, and the rest of us who play with it and use it in ways that extend the work that we're doing. I sort of love the idea coming out of manhood and out of the idea of time binding that, does it stop in a way with what he created here? Did he mean it to stop and say, read me my work, use it, and we'll all be the better for it?
Laura?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to this roundtable. And well, I would like to begin with a story because several years ago, Lance invited me to General Semantics, and of course I said yes. It's Lance Strate. So when I began to read General Semantics, I figured it out that General Semantics was talking about a non-Aristotelian theory. And well, I have to tell you that I'm a philosopher and I love Aristotle, so I couldn't believe it that this general semantics theory was talking about a non-Aristotelian theory. But that's something that I love it because general semantics is a system that has a relationship with different areas. So that's very important. And I figured it out how general semantics also has a great influence from Aristotle because Korzybski, admired Aristotle, and he was influenced by Aristotle because without Aristotle, his theory couldn't be non-Aristotelian, right? So, Korzybski also, it's very important because he found out that the Aristotelian theory didn't work in many areas. For example, communication. So I think it's very important what Korzybski did about looking for a better way to communicate, for a better way to find out how the people should have or should find better ways to communicate. So 5 years ago, we had in Mexico our elections, and well, it was a very difficult time in Mexico because we were involved with this kind of misinformation, misunderstanding, fake news. And I don't want to talk about the results, of course. But I think Korzybski, it's a very important person, a very important work, this book, The Science and Sanity, because it's very actual. We need to learn how to better communicate. We have to find better theories for understanding, for have a better communication between us. And I would like to invite you to read this new edition about science and sanity. I think also the preface from Lance is very good. He talks about some very important concepts in Korzybski, and we will have also a seminar about general semantics, an on-site seminar in London, and you are invited to. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add some things to what's been said. And I know that in our sort of humanistic and tradition and in media ecology, there's been a lot of criticism of science and scientism and rhetoric as well. So just to be clear on this, looking to science is important. And I think that we all kind of came to appreciate the importance of it during the pandemic, and especially in regard to all of the denialism that was coming from particularly the far right, in terms of, just, what it was about, what is happening, and that's continuing to coming today, and that even before that, that the same thing had been going on in terms of climate change, and then coming from, particularly, the vested interests, of the, in corporations and the 1%, and the politicians who support that. And of course, we could still trace it back to, say, the tobacco companies in a previous era, and all of these other, kinds of examples, and that there's something really fundamental about this idea of what a fact is. And, we sort of it became a great excuse for comedy to talk about alternate facts and truthiness and all of these sort of things that, we've been facing. But there's something very serious that's been going on as well. And, this is where, I think a lot of folks who may be familiar with Postman may see him as somebody who was very critical of science as well. And, his famous essay, Social Sciences, Moral Theology, where, and he was very critical of the social science and behavioral sciences, but he was also very much influenced by general semantics, and also very much a party to the fundamental idea of science and scientific method. And this traces back to folks like Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, Wittgenstein, and this idea of that we can test things out, that we can actually look to the world and test things out. And when you don't do that, you get lost in your own thought world and your own assumptions, and that it leads to really messed up kinds of stuff. And the famous quote from Bertrand Russell about your guy Aristotle is that Aristotle wrote that men have more teeth than women, and even though he was married, it never occurred to him to actually count them. And that is what we're talking about, to actually go out and look at the world. And that is the difference between rationality in ancient Greece, which was just about we can figure things out, in our heads, compared to modern rationality of the Enlightenment, which is test, 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 and revise based on the evidence, to not deny the evidence. And that was, in a previous era, that was largely, and I mean, into our own lifetimes, the denial, say, of evolution, which, someone like Walter Ong was one of the supporters of evolutionary theory, along with Teilhard de Chardin, at a time when the Catholic Church was saying, this is verboten, this is not good, right? But then it was also on the, ideologically, that one of the ways that Soviet science really fell apart was that they decided to embrace Lamarckian evolution because it fit in with their political ideology. And so whenever we're following that way, we're running into trouble. And that even further in the 20th century with Einstein and then later Heisenberg is this idea, and you mentioned non-identity. Nothing is identical to anything else. In science, there's no identity. But what we do first through perception is create a stable sense of reality, because if we really just saw everything as just whizzing about and chaotic, we'd go mad, right? And then through language, we add this idea of permanence, that things stay the same and that you're the same person from moment to moment. And these objects are stable objects, and that one thing can be considered identical. This table is identical to that table, when in reality there's always differences between any two things or any two times. So, but to try to take that into account in the way that we are describing and evaluating and understanding our reality, and that is, what we forget, I think, at times is the intimate relation in modernity between science and democracy, right? That are, in the US, the founders were both, they were committed to science as they were committed to democracy, that science is a democratic, kind of endeavor, and that democracy is rooted on the kind of rational evaluation of the world that science excels at, and that when one or the other, are, and that's why both are being undermined by the folks who are against democracy. So I think that's, particularly speaks to the relevance of for our time of this, where I think in the earlier guys that we look to, they were they kind of took for granted that everyone accepted that science was authoritative and that you can trust in the scientific method, and it's no longer the case. We've backslid, in that regard. The other thing I just want to underline is the importance that this is not just about language. This is one of the building blocks of systems theory. That the early systems theorists, you talk about Gregory Bateson, who was very big on this idea. Norris says how he's always was saying the map is not the territory. Ludwig von Bertalanffy calls it general systems theory, patterned after general semantics. If you're familiar with Maturana and Varela and autopoiesis, they're really talking, and I don't know that they're citing this, but they're just building on the set of ideas that are here. And so there's this idea, Korzybski talks about the neurosemantic and neurolinguistic environment, the verbal environment. Corey mentioned the organism as a whole in an environment, all of these connected by hyphens to try to say this is one thing. This is ecology. This is a move towards an ecological understanding in this direction that is very much part of media ecology, what we understand media ecology to be. You look like you want to.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think part of the reason I think the book was such a classic is that, that he's predating the congealing of all the specialist scientists that happened after the Second World War in, the social sciences. And that in some way, I don't know how many people today call themselves a scientist. People have a tendency to be like, well, I'm a bionuclear chemist, or they're very specific little subsets there. And so, I think he was still trying to get people very broadly.
What about Bill Nye?
The science guy.
Although I think he actually was an engineer. I thought I heard someone say that.
Yeah. If you go look at old et ceteras, though, when they had active, people writing letters to the editor and stuff, you just see a lot of a whole swath of very different kinds of scientists, whether it was medical doctors or engineers or people who were chemists. And I think, Korzybski was trying to, he brought together so many different disciplines. I think that's partly why he was robbed so heavily, that different people, they robbed him, took his ideas from, whether it was in neuroscience or it was in linguistics or it was in psychiatry, and they were able to take it and then not feel indebted to it because he was covering like everything. And they were like, no, I'm just interested in other specialists who are in my specialist area.
Well, should we open up to folks? Anyone want to? Judith, yeah.
It's a really, really interesting discussion and conversation. So I want to thank you for that. It's very stimulating. It seems to me that the challenge that you're outlining is really the challenge between empiricism and social constructivism. And so I wonder if you want to talk about that, and particularly where Korzybski places himself within that.
Well, sure. And I think of Postman's last book, Building a Bridge to the 20th Century. I think it's there where, he basically says that, we were talking about social construction back in the day because people were saying that, things like childhood are just natural. but never meant to take it to the extremes of the postmodernists, and to just deny everything. So, I think that, Korzybski opens the door to constructivism by saying that, we live in this world of high level abstractions that are disconnected from lived reality and facts on the ground. But at the same time, he says that there are facts on the ground. He's very much, in science, there's an objective reality. We can never know it fully, but we can get better, more accurate ideas of it and better maps. That's, you said, like the structural similarity between the map and the reality. The map's not the territory, but there are good maps that'll get you where you have to go, and there are bad maps that'll lead you astray. Right? Right? When you look at a map of the New World circa, like 1500s, and we laugh and go, ah ha ha, everything's all wrong. We improved on those maps.
I mean, one way to say this as well is that, when he was writing this, Lobachevsky and Riemann were both coming up with non-Euclidean geometries, right? Where the sum of the inner angles were a little bit above or a little bit below 180 when you go to really big or really small spaces. And so I think there you do see this kind of non-Aristotelianism where instead of being like geometry, there are geometries. It's still grounded in a kind of empiricism that is a discovery in a scientific mode, but it's also very much grounded in like facts of the matter, right? And so I would see him, in some way he's cutting against this sort of more classical philosophical distinction between the empiricists and the rationalists. And he's going like, there's a space in between there for the general semanticist who can accommodate for the ever-changing nature of reality, but also be rigorously invested in the mathematics project. Right. So, I mean, I think, and this is part of the problem with his notion of non-identity. When you talk about Korzybski's notion of non-identity, he's talking about everything in the empirical world. He's not talking about mathematical entities. Right. I mean, a two is a two, and a two is identical with itself. I mean, yeah, that's right. I mean, now you could say, well, a triangle is not necessarily identical to itself, but the triangle is too abstract. Right? I mean, what kind of a triangle? Is it a Euclidean or non-Euclidean triangle? So, but we still do have the sense of there being Euclidean or non-Euclidean. So, I mean, I think he is easily straddling and splitting the difference and overcoming some of those divisions. Right. I think, well, I would just say it's both. It's both. I mean, I think he's doing both a radical a kind of empiricism while also merging with a constructivism that's buttressed with rigorous mathematical orientations.
You're talking about the science and COVID and the people not believing the science. I've believed in science and the scientific method since I was a kid learning it in school. What I've found is that there's a big difference between what a scientist reports about their research and what a science teacher teaches about what scientists have discovered. And my experience of the whole pandemic thing is that, yes, there was science out there, but I found that I couldn't trust the people reporting what the science said because they all had an agenda. They all wanted me to act a certain way, to take on certain behaviors. And so I think a lot of it is the believability of the people reporting the science.
You mean through mass media and internet media and social media?
Yeah. And government policy. And
well, of course, that gets into politics then rather than science. That
exactly.
when,
yeah.
like, if science says there's and this is a virus that's airborne, and people say that's not true.
Well, also, I mean, with respect to, and Michael, I see your hand up, but with respect to the tradition of reporting, reporter has a beat. And so at what was formerly known as a newspaper, if you've got a reporter who is an expert in healthcare, well, healthcare is still a fairly, general topic area, but you have to trust that a person who has this expertise is not just a journalist who knows how to report and to analyze and to, parse information data. You're hoping that they will do the job of then presenting you with what you need to know. But that is not the environment of reportage that we live in
Right.
2024.
It was all people trying to influence you to believe a certain way on either side. There were those who were trying to say, no, this isn't, you shouldn't do these, whatever they're trying to get you to do. And there were those who were saying, yes, you've got to get vaccinated, you've got to wear masks, you've got to use hand sanitizer.
Well, and again,
But behind all that are the companies that are making money on this solution or that solution.
we're talking about it though in terms of science. Really, what has been called to question is expertise in general, and this idea that who are we sitting up here talking in front of an audience? What are we experts in? Come on, I know. Again, if there's no expertise, there are no facts, right? Then everything, not just science, everything is called to question.
Michael,
First question is, who's doing the audiobook?
you're volunteering?
I'll live that. But related to your question, and when most people cite Science and Sanity, they're doing so for the purpose of having people interrogate facts and labels, to reduce the impulse to have a reflexive connection between the label and the thing, to have some reflection. But I'm wondering if you could all speak to what Korzybski says about the problem of time buying. And that is that if you take something that's a fact that's located within a particular time period, time context, and then as further testing and as facts on the ground change, other people taking those earlier facts presented as facts and then using that as a weapon to say, oh, well, we could discredit you because you were wrong because this fact is wrong. See what's happening now without taking into account that these facts change over time. So I wonder if you could talk about how Korzybski deals with the problem of time buying.
My first reaction was abstraction, that we're talking about everyone abstracting differently, or so facts are more fungible, or facts are more malleable if you view it in terms of each of us is abstracting something different from the same facts. So maybe you can justify alternative facts in that way. I can't believe I'm justifying alternative facts.
Well,
I mean, I think Korzybski is going to say something about, the tentative nature of our facts, and that we have to be able to be corrected and to revise our position accordingly should new insights come out. I think I would go to something like, and it's not in, I'm not sure if I can't remember if it appears in here, but it's in the Olivet College lectures, and it's also in Manhood of Humanity, but his extensional theory of happiness, which basically he says, and this is his claim based in science, which is that the way to have a happy life is just to have absolutely no expectations. That expectations are a killer. Like, you can have all kinds of expectations about this, that, and it's just endless frustration. And if instead of having expectations, you just kind of roll with whatever is, accepting with whatever is. And he gives even an example, like, he's talking, he says, I'm hoping a lot of people attend my talk today. And he's like, oh, this might be trouble. What if people don't attend? I'm going to be upset and unhappy. And he's like, what if I just not have any expectations at all? And I'll just see whoever's there and just go with whatever's there. Again, this is why I think that he really is aligning with a lot of the insights of certain forms of Buddhism.
but maybe to Michael's point is that facts are always tentative, and we do the best we can. I mean, it's a pragmatic approach. So here are the facts as they are today. One of his devices, he comes up with a number of devices, extensional devices. One of them is dating, right? Which is just to put a date on things, stamp it on. So fact, this fact is the fact, it's a fact on February 6th. No, I'm sorry, what am I? June 6th, 2024. To understand that that's when it was established as a fact, which means that, in 2025, it may no longer be a fact because we've learned something else. And anyway, this is more, as we extend it and connect it to other aspects of science, like Karl Popper especially, that it can always be falsified. Actually, one of the interesting things we look at in general semantics, there are different kinds of statements, and a fact. One of the biggest misunderstandings or confusions is between the idea of a fact as a phenomenon out there, as opposed to the fact that a fact as a verbal statement that we make. And it's a statement that can be tested, which is why there are false facts, right? A fact is a statement that can be tested, and we can determine it to be true or false, or if it's a generalization, it can be falsified. You can never quite prove a generalization true because you'd have to see every instance in which it applies. But that's, Popper's point. But the point is that it's testable, but it never is. It's always open to retesting and further testing.
And I think that's why abstraction is so crucial, because what we mean by a fact is what's been extracted out as a fact, and there's all kinds of nebulous interconnections.
We abstract it out of its context in a particular place, in a particular time, among particular people, and generalize from that. But that's why we have to always keep going back. That's the point. And you can't do it like all the time with everything, because you'd be like nuts. But for things that are significant, or when you run into problems, you have to go back and keep checking because situations change.
But no, an extension of your question to me is to say, but is there ever going to be, collective, unanimous, absolute agreement among all of us, right? Because isn't that what but we're all flawed, we're all imperfect, we all come from our own epistemic set of, learning and knowledge and values and attitudes and beliefs. And so we're all trying to grapple with these things individually, that, again, that the instruction manual is trying to help us to do. But are we going to ever come to agreement in that kind of way? That's the time-binding problem for me.
Well, just quickly on that, agreement only happens when you have enough common ground together. So when you don't have enough common ground together, you have deep disagreement, and I think where we want to get is enough common ground so that we can have meaningful agreement or disagreement. But that there has to be a common ground. But I wanted to also pick up on what Corey said in terms of Korzybski's, if I'm saying his name correct, his notion of happiness. Aristotle's in the Nicomachean Ethics is, to him, happiness is teleological. And I'm sure you probably know it better than me, but it's the virtuous exercise of reason over the course of a life. And the reason I want to bring up that point is just, I want to see if I'm getting you guys correctly on that, because you're saying his approach isn't rationalist. And what I'm understanding, that it's more empirical. And what I'm understanding is both in contrast to that of antiquity and the more rationalist Kantian one that's picked up by the postmodernists, that he's in neither camp. So I wanted to ask Laura, if you could just give me the 3 or 4 major points where he's breaking with Aristotle, and I'm assuming that he would be breaking from the organic of him. Just to help me situate this a bit better. What would you say the 3 or 4 major points are where he's breaking with Aristotle?
Well, I think first of all is about the abstraction, because as you know, Aristotle, just to say that it's very difficult to make a law about everything, because when we generalize, we are in danger for mistakes, right? We cannot say that all the phones are functionable, for example, because maybe one of them are not. So we fail in the law. So I think this is something important. And in this, Korzybski goes against Aristotle. Other thing, it's about communication, of course, because even that Aristotle talks about the rhetoric and I don't know, simple laws about how to speak or rules about how to speak. I think Korzybski has a better way or a better, I don't know, examples or, yes, activities to have a better understanding between people. So, well, I just wrote an article about the differences between Aristotle and Korzybski, and some similarities too. So I think it's a reality that Aristotle was very good in his time, but today, with the modern science, with all the things we are living, well, many things have changed.
Gary.
I'm loath to ask this question. I've been very impressed by your ability to analyze. I'm jealous of it, frankly, because I'll never get to that point. Maybe when I grow up, I will. But how does it apply to my understanding and appreciation of the Chopin sonata?
How does this?
Yeah,
To a large extent, that's outside of the concern, which is about how we relate to external reality. But what Korzybski said about poetry, I think, applies to the arts in general. He said that there are things that poetry can reveal to us that other forms cannot. So, I mean, he was married to a painter. There's a painting of Korzybski in the collection of the Chicago Art Institute. I think so. And he had an appreciation and understanding. And I think, what we would say is that there are a different way of abstracting out something about the world, that's what we do through art and communication. And it conveys something different that we could not be conveyed by words or by mathematics, although probably it's closer to mathematics in certain ways. So I think that is what the answer would be. That you've
It prompts a question in my mind, and I'm not sure how to even phrase this, so forgive me as I try to work this through. The role of language in abstraction. Because in many ways, our creation of facts, and I'm using the term creation, is a descriptor of what we see. And we create language that we then find provable. So yes, science must be able to prove what it does, but through a scientific system, which is human created. And this, I use the easy example of, well, what are we going to do planetary description? I know, I'll invent calculus.
which, by the way, Korzybski was big on calculus because that takes into account change. Right?
So my question is, pointing to this, is, the language we create to establish these things or facts remain a human creation.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore are on, what shall we say, an ungrounded or a consensual basis. How does that fit?
I'll just leave it. I mean, I think some of this, I'd use Dewey, go to Dewey's language, right? Which is that language turns events into objects, right? The reality is process, it's event. But as our nervous systems abstract out, we then take those abstractions and then we further abstract with language. So I go like this. Everybody see this? See it? What is it? Fist. Where'd my fist go? See, there's a sense in which, like, you were right there, you were looking at this perceptual process that we could all recognize as this thing, and then we called it a fist. But then when I go, where'd my fist go? We start to realize that we're confusing orders of reality. There's an event, there's a sort of abstraction that's happening perceptually, then there's verbal abstractions.
The verbal abstraction, when you went like this and I saw it, I went, yes, resistance. In other words,
right.
We abstract so distantly that the perceptions become lensed.
That's right.
And when what prompted the question is exactly things that are ineffable, and I used that term earlier today, things that are ineffable in one linguistic system, mathematics, become effable in poetry or visual language. This drive for linguistic creation is really, I mean, it's wonderfully exciting, and I'm not sure how he addresses this.
I would just add that so there's the creation of language itself in the first place, which has a rule system, and again, it's syntactical, right? There's sequence matters. Tom bit the dog is different than Tom bit the dog. And then there's how we create using the language, which is infinite, right? But that's two parts of creation to it, and I think it's important to think about, that part of it.
I mean, I think part of it is that we have no direct connection to the outer world, because forget language, sense perception is just it's just a response to stimuli. It's, I always say, like, there are light photons are landing on the retina and it irritates some sensitive tissue, which causes nerves to fire, and they fire into the brain. But it's not, fiber optics. It's not carrying an image into the brain. We've just constructed that. And that's all in here. I mean, he's talking about that kind of thing in the 1930.
Aristotle talks about
Yeah,
that too.
but at the same time, it's not complete. We can't go into the solipsism because if we unless you posit that you're like, it's a complete work active, everything's completely imaginary, then that you can knock into a table, you can hurt yourself, and so and that's where he arrives at. Well, it's structure, right? Yeah. Structure, it's relation, and it's that whether it's sense perception or language, that we create something structurally similar to whatever's out there in order to navigate it, in order to deal with it. And to the extent that there is structural similarity, it works. To the extent that it isn't, we get screwed up. And that we can find ways to make it more similar to what's out there rather than less similar. I mentioned Maturana and Varela before. They use the term structural coupling in the Tree of Knowledge book that they did, to express the same idea. We're coupled, right, by nature as a product of the biological and physical environment. We are coupled with whatever is out there. We are formed to respond to whatever is out there. For our own, we're part of that. Part of that ecology. It has to be. It has to work that way. But again, we can find ways to do it better.
It's only an approximation.
Yeah.
It's an approximation of reality, and the awareness that it's an approximation, that it's not the reality, is, I think, part of what Korzybski's underscoring that so many people don't consider.
And I think, Michael, to really just cut back to your original question, I mean, that you want to, if we're going to force the issue, Aristotle's pre-Darwin. For Aristotle, horses always existed. That's the problem.
And are always horses.
There were always horses, and horses always existed. You get the principle of identity. You get A is A is not B, and there's no middle ground. Darwin says bullshit, and Korzybski's in line with that.
No, and I understand
Yeah.
it is that it's, like a linguistic system, and as Thom says, it is an ever-refining process.
Right.
And I mean, it's this constant testability, which I think is true in linguistics, and also true in scientific study, that it's this constant effort to describe, and not just precision and effort, but also understandings move on. I mean, exactly your point.
Well, we're really actually past time, and
Thank you.
we're about to embark on lunch. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I just learned recently that